All right, welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
So this is where we take your sources, could be articles, research papers, notes, you name it, and really try to boil them down.
Yeah, cut through the noise, find the signal, what's actually important.
Exactly. Get you those key insights, the surprising bits, the stuff that makes you feel genuinely up to speed fast.
We do the heavy lifting, you get the insights. That's the plan.
And today, well, today we're diving into a really fascinating area. It's right at that crossroads of who we say we are and what our biology tells us.
We're talking about self-reported race and ethnicity, how people identify themselves versus genetic ancestry.
Which is, what your DNA says about where your ancestors actually came from geographically.
And for this deep dive, we've got a couple of really solid sources. First up is a huge recent study from the NIH, the All of Us research program.
Yeah, massive data set from the U.S., hundreds of thousands of people. That's the real cutting edge stuff.
And we're pairing that with an older review from 2005. It's foundational, though. Gives crucial background on human variation, the science, the history of how we even started thinking about race.
Right, sets the stage.
So our mission today is basically to unpack what these two sources tell us when we put them together. Why does this distinction between identity and ancestry matter?
Especially for things like health research, right?
Definitely. And what does this giant All of Us data set really reveal about the genetic landscape of the U.S. right now?
And I'll give you a hint. It confirms some things geneticists have kind of known for a while, but the scale, it's striking, might challenge some common ideas.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity.
Okay, let's jump in. Where should we start? Maybe defining our terms.
Good idea. Because the sources are really clear about this distinction. It's crucial.
Okay, so first, self-reported race and ethnicity. This is about identity, how you see yourself.
Often tied to culture, history, maybe language, or the boxes society gives you, like on the U.S. Census. It's fundamentally social and cultural.
A sociocultural construct, as they say.
Exactly. How you fit in, how groups are seen. Then, flip side, genetic ancestry.
This is the biology bit.
Purely biological. It's about the patterns in your DNA, reflecting where your ancestors lived thousands of years ago. Human migration history, basically, written in your genes.
And right off the bat, the big headline from that new All of Us study is, well, for a lot of folks in the U.S., these two things don't line up neatly.
Yeah, your self-reported identity doesn't perfectly map onto your genetic ancestry pattern.
And the study points out this isn't exactly news to geneticists, right?
Not really. They've understood for a long time that social categories like race and ethnicity aren't great stand-ins for underlying genetic patterns. They're just different kinds of information.
So this massive new data set is basically providing really strong modern proof for something the science has indicated for decades.
Precisely. It brings it into sharp focus with incredible detail.
Maybe we should quickly touch on that background science from the 2005 review about human variation itself.
Yeah, that's helpful context. It starts with the fact that, genetically speaking, all humans are pretty closely related.
We share a relatively recent common origin.
Right. Most evidence points to emerging from Africa, then migrating out across the globe. That shared history isn't that long ago in evolutionary terms.
And because of that, this is the part that always gets me. That 2005 review says the vast majority of human genetic differences are found within any single population group.
It's a staggering number. Somewhere like 85% to 95% of all the variation exists inside, say, Europeans or inside East Asians or inside sub-Saharan Africans.
Which means only a tiny fraction, like 5% to 15%, is what distinguishes those large continental groups from each other.
Exactly. Compared to other mammals, we're actually remarkably similar genetically. Less diverse than chimpanzees, for example.
Which feels weird because we look around and see so much physical difference.
And most of that visible difference, things like height or face shape, generally follows the same pattern most variation is within the group. But the review points out a big exception.
Skin color.
Skin color. It behaves differently. Genetically, about 90% of the variation related to skin color is between major geographic groups, not within them.
Why is that?
Strong natural selection. It's linked to UV radiation levels and the body's need to produce vitamin D. Different environments, different pressures, leading to different adaptations.
So places with strong sun push towards darker skin for protection. Places with less sun push towards lighter skin for vitamin D.
Basically, yeah. And crucially, the review notes that similar skin tones could evolve independently in different places facing similar sun exposure.
Meaning dark skin in sub-Saharan Africa and dark skin in, say, parts of southern India or indigenous Australia doesn't automatically mean those groups are super closely related genetically overall.
Exactly. It's convergent evolution driven by a strong environmental factor, not necessarily recent shared ancestry at that continental scale.
Okay, so that's the biology. We're mostly similar. Variation is mostly within groups. It's kind of clinal, meaning gradual changes across geography, except for specific traits like skin color that adapted strongly to environment.
Right. But then, humans took those visible differences, especially skin color, and built a whole social system on top of them.
Yeah, the 2005 review gets into the history of race as a concept.
It argues it largely emerged and solidified during the European era of exploration, colonialism, and particularly the transatlantic slave trade.
It was a tool, wasn't it, to justify power structures?
Absolutely. The idea was to link these, perceived physical differences to inherent qualities, intelligence, morality, whatever, to rationalize hierarchies, slavery, discrimination.
And this got tangled up with early attempts at scientific classification in the 18th, 19th centuries.
Yes, often in ways that weren't very scientific by today's standards. It led to what the review calls the ideology of race.
The belief that these racial groups are like real, distinct, natural, biological categories that have always existed.
Primordial, enduring categories. But this neat idea immediately crashed into reality.
Because human variation isn't neat boxes, it's messy.
It's continuous, it's clinal, and especially in places like the Americas, with centuries of mixing between people from Europe, Africa, and the indigenous populations, the categories just didn't fit the lived reality of people's ancestries.
That's where you get bizarre social rules like the one-drop rule in the U.S.
Exactly. Legal and social systems forcing people with complex, mixed ancestries into these overly simple, rigid boxes that denied their actual heritage.
And the sources mention that sometimes people's identities or how they were classified even changed over time because the social labels just didn't reflect their complex reality.
Yeah, the mismatch was always there.
Okay, fast forward back to today. We have this historical context, the basic science. Now let's look at this huge all of us data set. Over 230,000 genomes analyzed. What does it show?
Well, it powerfully confirms the details that mismatch in the contemporary U.S. population. The sheer scale is what's new, analyzing about 2 million genetic markers per person.
Gives incredible resolution.
Right. And what they found was that people's genetic ancestries didn't fall into neat, separate clusters that matched self-reported labels like white or black or Asian.
Instead,
it looked like gradients, mixtures. People had varying proportions of ancestry tracing back to different continents. It was continuous, not categorical.
can you give some specific examples from this study?
Sure. Like, among participants who self-identified as Black or African American, there was a really wide spectrum in the amount of genetic ancestry they had from Africa versus Europe. No single African American genetic profile.
It varied a lot from person to person.
A huge amount. And another interesting group was people who declined to state a race, over 90% of whom identified as Hispanic or Latino ethnicity.
What did their genetics show?
A really broad mix. Varying combinations of ancestry from Africa, Europe, and the indigenous Americas. It really highlights how the standard U.S. racial categories just don't work for many people, especially those with roots in Latin America.
Doesn't capture their identity or their complex heritage?
Not at all. And the study actually makes a point of celebrating this diversity. They say the All of Us database shows how Americans come from every corner of the world, and its genetic diversity rivals, or even exceeds standard global reference panels.
Wow, so the U.S. truly is genetically diverse, reflecting that history.
Absolutely. But here's where the All of Us study gets really interesting, I think. They didn't just look at broad continental ancestry, like African or European.
They went deeper.
They looked at subcontinental ancestry, using genetic markers that can point to more specific regions within a continent, like differentiating between West African and East African ancestry, for example.
Okay, why is that level of detail important, especially for health research?
Because those big continental labels can lump together populations with very different genetic histories and potentially different health-related genetic variants. They can be, as the study authors put it, artificial.
Got an example of why that matters.
A really striking one from the study. They found that having more ancestry from West Central Africa was associated with a higher average body mass index, or BMI.
Okay.
But having more ancestry from East Africa was associated with a lower average BMI.
Whoa, so ancestry from different parts of Africa showed opposite associations with BMI.
Exactly. Even after they tried to control for social and environmental factors.
Yeah.
It's a stark demonstration that just saying African ancestry can hide really important underlying differences. It masks the complexity.
That really underscores why those broad categories aren't sufficient for understanding potential genetic influences on health.
It does. The authors explicitly say we shouldn't just default to these big continental buckets.
And did they see regional differences within the U.S. too? Like, do ancestry patterns vary depending on where people live?
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. Reflecting different migration and settlement histories within the U.S., for instance, among Black participants, they saw tendencies for higher proportions of West African ancestry in the Southeast compared to other regions.
Makes sense historically.
And among Hispanic or Latino participants, the specific mix of European, Indigenous American, and African ancestries varied quite a bit by state, often mirroring different colonial histories and subsequent migrations.
Okay, so the picture is clear. Social labels don't equal genetic ancestry, and genetic ancestry is complex, continuous, and shows important variation even within continents and regions. Let's connect this back to health. Why is making this distinction so critical?
Well, we know there are major health disparities in the U.S. between groups defined by race and ethnicity. Huge differences in rates of many diseases, mortality rates.
It's undeniable, and it's tempting maybe because society uses these race categories to assume those health differences are mainly driven by genetic differences between the groups.
That's the common assumption, or at least a persistent question. But both sources, especially that 2005 review, argue strongly against that being the primary explanation for most common diseases.
They point elsewhere.
They point overwhelmingly toward social and environmental factors. Things like the health impacts of systemic racism and discrimination, unequal access to good health care, differences in socioeconomic status, exposure to environmental toxins, chronic stress.
All the social determinants of health.
Precisely. The 2005 review used that really powerful example, comparing infant mortality rates for Black and white people inside the U.S. military health system versus outside it.
What did that show?
Inside the military system, where things like income, housing, and especially access to health care are much more equalized, the disparity in infant mortality between Black and white families was dramatically smaller than in the general U.S. population.
Wow. So when you level the playing field environmentally and socially, the health outcome gap shrinks significantly.
It strongly suggests the huge disparity seen broadly is driven mainly by those social and environmental inequities, not by some underlying biological difference between the groups.
So the takeaway isn't that genetics plays no role in health differences between populations.
No, genetics definitely plays a role, especially in certain single gene disorders that are more common in specific ancestral groups, like sickle cell anemia or Tay-Sachs disease.
But for the common, complex diseases, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, where we see the biggest population-level disparities.
For those, the current evidence suggests that genetic differences between these large socially defined groups are unlikely to be the main driver. Their contribution is probably small compared to the massive impact of social and environmental factors.
Which creates a tricky situation for researchers, right? The 2005 review talked about this. Should studies even use race and ethnicity categories?
It's a genuine dilemma. On one hand, using these categories can unintentionally reinforce the flawed idea that race is biological. It might promote stereotypes.
And it could distract from investigating the real root causes, the social and environmental ones.
Right. But on the other hand, because society is structured by race and ethnicity, these categories do correlate strongly with exposure to those very social and environmental factors.
So being in a certain group is linked to experiences of discrimination or living in poorer neighborhoods or having less access to healthy food, things that directly impact health.
Exactly. So the argument for using them is that they can serve as a proxy, albeit a crude one, for those important non-genetic exposures that researchers need to account for. It also has some technical uses in genetic studies to control for population background, though there are better genetic ways to do that now.
It's a balancing act, then, using the category to capture social reality without implying biological determinism.
It is, and it requires extreme care in interpretation and communication.
So how is research moving forward? Are we finding better ways?
I think the clear trend, highlighted by both the history and the new All of Us findings, is towards more precision.
Moving beyond the broad labels.
Yes. Instead of using race ethnicity as a rough proxy, researchers are increasingly using detailed genetic ancestry information like that subcontinental data when genetics is relevant.
And maybe even more importantly,
trying to directly measure the actual social and environmental factors. Instead of using race as a proxy for discrimination, try to measure experiences of discrimination. Instead of using it as a proxy for socioeconomic status, measure income, education, wealth, directly.
Get at the mechanisms causing the disparities, not just the label associated with them.
Precisely. Measure diet, stress, pollution exposure, healthcare access. All the things we suspect are the real drivers.
And we're seeing shifts outside research, too. You mentioned the Census Bureau.
Yeah, the All of Us paper notes. The plan changes for the 2030 U.S. Census, combining the race and ethnicity questions and allowing people to check multiple boxes or write in specifics. It's an acknowledgement from a major institution that the old categories don't reflect how many people identify or the complexity of the population.
It feels like this really needs people from different fields talking to each other. Geneticists, sociologists, public health folks, historians.
Oh, absolutely. It's inherently interdisciplinary. You need all those perspectives to understand the interplay of genes, environment, history, and social structures. And careful communication is paramount.
We have to talk about this complexity without falling back into simplistic, potentially harmful biological race thinking.
That's the challenge. And one last crucial point the All of Us study makes. Remember, this whole discussion is very U.S.-centric.
Right. The way these social categories developed and how they relate or don't relate to genetic patterns is specific to U.S. history.
Exactly. Countries like Brazil or Mexico, which the source mentions, have totally different histories of colonization, mixing, and social classification. The relationship between identity and ancestry would look different there. You can't just export these findings wholesale.
Very important caveat. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. What's the core message from this deep dive?
I think it boils down to this. Self-identity, social categories, and genetic inheritance are three distinct things. They interact, they influence each other, but they're not the same.
They're different layers of reality.
Yeah. And understanding that distinction is absolutely critical, especially if we want to understand health disparities and actually do something effective about them.
And these huge studies like All of Us are just invaluable, aren't they? For showing with data the incredible complexity and diversity that gets hidden when we use overly broad labels.
They really drive home that genetic variation is mostly continuous, mostly within group, and that the social categories we use are constructs built on top of that reality, not direct reflections of it.
Forces us to look deeper.
And to focus on the powerful role of environment, society, and lived experience in shaping health outcomes.
Okay, so here's something to leave you, the listener, thinking about. Knowing this, understanding the difference between social constructs like race and the biological reality of genetic ancestry, how does that change how you think about your own identity? Or about the group differences you observe in the world? And maybe most critically, how might it change how we approach trying to solve health disparities and other social challenges moving forward? What does this deeper understanding mean for action? Lots to chew on there.